All right, everyone. It is roughly week 2 of actual tournaments going on for set 4. And we've got really big ones going on today. We've got the sector qualifier over in Liverpool and the sector qualifier over in Denver. Now, these have not finished, but these are going to be most likely the deciding factor for FFG to choose what to do with especially Jango, because that's the big question right now, but also some other options in the meta. Are we going to be seeing a couple of the, what a lot of people are considering problem cards like Triple Dark Raid or DJ or whatever that is? Are they going to be restricted? Are they going to be banned? Are we going to be seeing Jango be banned? What are we really looking for if we're FFG to figure out what should be banned? That is the question. And I want to dive into the meta breakdown over in Liverpool because we have the decks that showed up, at least the leader composition. And I will say, Jango is still at the top. Now, it's not as dominant in terms of how much of the meta is Jango, but we have not seen the winners yet. And that is a huge thing that FFG is looking for. A big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. Also, I have a TCG player link in the description down below. Let's talk about Jango real quick. Starting us off with the Liverpool meta breakdown. So, looks like we've got 400 and roughly 20 decks entered. And of those decks entered, we've got 76 of them being Jango. Now, this is not as much as the previous week. We had was 26% of the meta of one of the tournaments being Jango Fett. This one is roughly 18%, which is still far and above the majority. If you look at the second most played list, which is Quinlan Voss, it's at 37. It's less than half of what Jango's sitting at. After that, all the lists are pretty close, to be honest. Quinlan, Piet, Boba Fett, set 4 Boba Fett, that is, 31, 28, 37, all relatively close. Following that up, we got 23 Sabines and Palps, 18 Cad Banes and Han 1s, and 16 Luke 4s, 15 Gar Saxon. Like, that's a pretty healthy meta. We just have one outlier, and that is Jango Fett. Now, if we look at the other previous tournaments from last week, the biggest concern wasn't actually the fact that Jango took 26% of the meta. That sometimes just happens, right? Some people are convinced that a certain deck's going to be the best. They come in droves. It's really when you start to get to like day 2 of tournaments or top 64s, top 16s, top 8s, the winners. That's when it gets a little bit scary. And if we look back, I believe it was it Milan? That was of the top 12, there was 11 Jangos. Is that, if I'm not mistaken? Regardless of the top 12, I know the top 8, 7 of the 8 of that tournament was Jango Fett. That was massive. And of that weekend, I believe it came out to 13 of the 24 top 8 lists were Jango Red, which was more than Boba Fett ever accomplished in terms of stats over the course of set 2. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people are sick of Jango. A lot of people are saying ban him. If we were going by those statistics, it would be an immediate ban. Immediate ban. There is no real argument here. If FFG is going to remain consistent and you're going to use FFG's baseline statements as the reasons or as your argument, FFG clearly stated that when Boba Fett was over 50% of the winners and over 40% of the top 8s, that was far too much. They ban him. Well, Jango Fett, if you look at that single week, that's a problem. Period. Jango is on the chopping block. But this is where I say this tournament and this weekend is really key, because we are getting a complete breakdown of the new meta and how it's going to, the competitive state and the balancing of the game on April 9th, which means this weekend, along with last weekend, are going to be the actual data that FFG uses to determine their decision, most likely why they scheduled that stream for April 9th. Jango Fett here, being a large portion of the meta, is initially not that concerning, unless you just don't like Jango. And regardless of the results that you think FFG should ban Jango, which is a reasonable concern, because that is what a lot of people, or a lot of TCGs rather, will ban for, is in competitive games. If there's a lot of mirrors that are not that exciting, sometimes they just remove matchups just because of the interest of competitive enjoyment. But in terms of just straight up results, in terms of OP, in terms of balancing the game because one leader is, or at least feels, undefeatable, Jango Fett needs to be putting up results this weekend. Now, if it's somewhere around the ballpark of 40 to 50% of the top 8s, it falls into that wheelhouse of, yeah, Jango Fett probably just gets immediate banned. Like, that would be my prediction if FFG remains consistent. Because, again, this is not like out of the blue or anything like that. If you refer to the previous ban announcement, a leader suspended with the Boba Fett, I reviewed this in many videos at this point. They literally quoted that type of number for the finishes for a deck was far too much. So that is a problem. Jango Fett coming in of 18% of the decks, they hadn't actually stated whether or not that's something that they care about, right? They only really cared about, or at least they only specifically mentioned, the fact that Boba Fett was a significant portion of the finishes. But here's the other thing about Boba Fett in regards to taking over the large portion of the initial meta, was that Boba Fett was split across a few different archetypes. So you had Boba Green, you had Boba Yellow as the two most, you had Boba Red following that up, and you even had Boba Blue. And all of them had a portion of the meta. And in some cases, like Boba Red and Boba Blue, a good portion more than most of their decks that were also competitively viable, which gave a little bit of, I'm not going to say like it was enjoyable to watch Boba Red and Boba Blue and Boba Yellow and Boba Green. Like, honestly, most of them were pretty classic and not exactly like super exciting to watch. Like, the decks that I think are super exciting to watch right now are Boba 4. Boba 4, Piet is another one that's really fun to watch. The other one I like personally, Cad Bane, as well as Luke 4 and Gar Saxon. Those are my top 5 right now. Piet, Boba 4, Luke 4, Gar Saxon, and Cad Bane. Sabine, Emperor Palpatine, Quinlan, and Jango. A lot of these are things that we're used to, but some of these really pushing in and really doing some work. And with Jango, it's basically one archetype, and that is Jango Tarkin Town. Now, I haven't seen the specific breakdown of Jango Fett in this tournament and the previous tournament as to whether or not a portion of these Jangos, like 10 of the 76, are Jango Greens or Jango Blues. But there is a vast majority of them being Jango Reds, whereas, again, Boba Fett, it was honestly like a ton of Boba Greens, but also a ton of Boba Yellows. Like, they were pretty close in terms of the demographics of Boba. The fact that Jango is vast majority Jango Red is a point against it in terms of competitive enjoyment, in terms of viewers watching. Generally speaking, that is the general methodology for which TCGs balance some of the competitive play. It comes in actual gameplay balance, the actual competitive healthiness, the feedback of the community, including the watchability of certain competitive matches. But then there's the other question is like, okay, yes, so let's say this is all true and Jango's going to get banned, right? Or at least Jango is looked at and there is something going to be banned, because we talked about potentially some of the problem cards. Triple Dark Raid and DJ are the number 1 and number 2 in terms of cards that people think should be looked at to potentially be banned. I know I've heard some other, people mentioning some other cards that definitely are strong, but I don't think any of them have reached that level of annoyance that those two cards have introduced for people, right? Triple Dark Raid is truly one of the most absurd cards that we have seen. In fact, I would say the most absurd card that we have seen from the game so far. In terms of just how many options you have, it is incredibly good. Now, with that, will they consider banning one of those? And I think the biggest kind of component to this that a lot of people haven't really mentioned yet is rotation. Rotation's actually coming in 3 sets, guys. It's really not that far away in the grand scheme of things. The question is, okay, if that is the case, which direction, which kind of thought process would they gravitate towards? Do you ban Triple Dark Raid and DJ from one of the prior sets that will be rotating out in 3 sets, and you don't have to worry about them and make them only legal in their secondary format, whatever that format's going to be, or maybe ban them in that one too if they just end up being super broken? Who knows? You never know what they're going to do. Or do they ban Jango Fett and prevent Jango Fett from potentially becoming a problem despite the Triple Dark Raid and DJ potentially being banned? Like, yes, they could ban Triple Dark Raid. And I haven't really played a ton of lists without Triple Dark Raid. and to be honest with Jango Fett, I've played some now. There are 2 of them lists, but that was way back a long time ago. And I have played the Triple Dark Raid version, but I haven't omitted those cards in the interest of seeing what the deck is like without Triple Dark Raid. Although I can tell you what the feeling of Triple Dark Raid is, and I think Jango might still have a pretty solid shot at being a very powerful deck. Now, it will mitigate a lot of Jango's options because Triple Dark Raid is gone, but the cards like War Juggernaut are still going to be good. Cards like P38 are still going to be good. IG 2000 are still going to be good. It's just the things like maybe Triple Dark Raid for Devastator or Triple Dark Raid for War Juggernaut on like turn 3 instead of turn 5 is going to be way less oppressive. And of course, you don't get an immediately readied up attacker, so you don't necessarily need to or have a easier way to close out the game against some of the more soft control / hard control lists, right? So does Jango come back and be one of the stronger decks with potentially new cards being revealed? And so maybe they just ban Jango to prevent that from happening again, because that could certainly be possible. Now, I think if you were to take away Triple Dark Raid in terms of the current state, I think it would heavily nerf Jango Fett to the point where some other decks could definitely come back in the meta. And some other decks like number 2, 3, 4, Quinlan Voss, Piet, Boba, whatever you put in those slots. I'm just looking at the list right now in front of our face. But like Quinlan Voss, Piet, Boba, the ones that are at the top, do actually have a nice chance of maybe evening out in terms of the competitive viability. Now, I should say Boba 4 would also get heavily nerfed, I would have to say, to the point where it probably isn't in one of the more played options just because Triple Dark Raid is a core component of that deck as well. So, which way do they go? Do they wait for rotation and allow us to kind of fight amongst ourselves over these earlier set cards? Or do they and preserve one of their set 4 leaders, which is supposedly lasting for a couple of years? Because again, this is the first set of a second block, is what I'm going to call it. Block, the first block 0 or whatever. Then we have block A for 4, 5, and 6. Well, block 0 is rotating out, so keep Jango because it's going to be in your standard or premier format for a longer time, or try to nerf Jango with the hope that you can keep Jango in and then take away the card that's potentially rotating out. I don't know. That's a good question. Or maybe they just think Triple Dark Raid is just too strong in general, regardless of it being rotated out, to have it in the format, period. Maybe it's just too unfair. Because, yeah, maybe Jango gets banned, but maybe Boba 4 still dominates or starts to dominate just completely and utterly because of Jango Fett being gone. Because Jango tends to be a reasonable matchup into Boba Fett in terms of being able to exhaust all the things that Boba Fett's trying to do, right? They Triple Dark Raid, you play a P38, and their Triple Dark Raid just gets bounced back to their hand. Like, there's things like that happen with the Boba Fett deck that, well, Jango Fett's pretty good against, right? So there's a lot of things to consider here. But at the end of the day, I think it really boils down to tonight. And tomorrow, if we see 50% of the top 8's being Jango. Yeah, I think Jango's probably just gone because people are sick of playing Jango or seeing Jango. But if it's a little bit more nuanced to where maybe they feel like they could take away a couple of cards, I think that could be a potential, really dependent on the results of this weekend. Will shift the decision one way or another. I think the PR win would be to take Jango away, because that's what people, view as the core problem when they're seeing Jango win all the tournaments. I'm not arguing that that is the core problem versus Triple Dark Raid. I do think Jango is a strong deck even without Triple Dark Raid, but Triple Dark Raid is a huge power bump. But it's also nice to see Boba Fett from set 4 using Triple Dark Raid, right? And I think if Boba Fett from set 4 was number 1 deck, I think that's actually less annoying to most players just because of the way Boba 4 plays versus Jango. Boba 4 is more about pushing damage versus Jango just coming in and making you not play the game, right? So I think that'd be more of a PR win for FFG. And that might just be the decision that they go with. So we will have to see. I think that's most likely what's going to happen is Jango's going to be a good portion of the wins here. Perhaps we'll see some surprises. There are a good chunk of decks that people are kind of modifying to try to beat Jango Fett. And I think that is something that you could absolutely do. But Jango's still the king. And based on what we're seeing here, like Quinlan's, Piet's, Boba's, Palps, Sabine's, Cads, like these are all pretty standard matchups that we saw in the previous tournament. So in terms of this field, I could see Jango taking a good chunk of those top 8s. And again, doesn't have to be a ton. Just has to be, 4 of the top 8. I mean, it is still a ton, to be honest, but not as many as like last week's 7 of 8 or 13 of 24. That is a lot. Probably you only have to do probably a little bit less than that, even like 3 of the top 8 of this tournament. And of course, it is spread across this tournament and the other one, which we haven't been able to talk about too much just because of the kind of, tournament being in North America, which is where I'm in, whereas the Liverpool is in another country a few hours ahead of me. So we're able to see the breakdown of the decks right now, whereas Denver hasn't shown its face yet in terms of at least on melee.gg or anyone posting any lists. So question is, what are we going to see tonight? What are we going to see tomorrow? And these are going to determine our April 9th balance stream, realistically. Jango's definitely on the chopping block, but are they actually going to go through with it? Are they going to go through with it? Or are we going to see a shakeup? Are we going to see Quinlan Voss be 7 of the 8 top 8s? Maybe it's a cunning problem. Maybe they'll start trying to rebalance cunning. Who knows? That's another conversation that we've had to have. But I think that conversation should probably wait until we see what happens with some of the top decks like Jango in the balance stream next week. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and I'll see you all for the next one.